Hey, Cornerstone family. Welcome to Truth Bytes. That's a podcast by Cornerstone Church. The goal of this podcast is to help Christians identify issues that are trending in the culture and examine it from a Christian worldview. The topic tonight is one of depth and significance to a lot of us because we really wouldn't be who we are without others investing in us. And tonight we remember, and we're just going to chat about Ravi Zacharias. He passed away last week, and he has made a profound impact on my life and Pastor Paul's life and Prashanth's life and Phil Rich's life as well. So, gentlemen, I'm glad that you're able to join us this evening, and we can reflect on Ravi's life and how he impacted us as people, as church leaders, husbands, fathers, and how we can invest in the next generation because of the way that he has modeled for us. So I guess I'll start with you, Prashanth. I'm kind of taking your role this evening as moderator, but mainly because Ravi has invested in you through his books. I know you've met him personally. So how did you come to hear of Ravi, and what was kind of your first impressions of his teachings and his ministry?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It goes back a long ways, actually. I was in my early 20s. I believe I was 21, actually. And I had occasionally heard the name of Ravi Zacharias on and off, but I had actually never seen him. I'd never listened to any of his stuff. But I was in my early 20s, going through a very important phase in my life where God was really helping me to lean in on the rationality of the Christian faith. There was a friend at my work who was introducing me to new authors like Philip Yancey and C.S. Lewis, and he had mentioned Ravi's name a couple of times. And so I was kind of on my own journey at the time where, I was born and raised in a Christian home, but it was a very nominal Christian faith, and there was really not a lot of depth to it. But that started to change in the early 20s. And I remember having lots of conversations with my non-believing friends, and they were really provoking me to think deeply about the Christian faith. And it was in that particular season that all of this stuff was going on. And I remember this one time I went to my church in India, and I'm sitting there, and my pastor walks up, and he said, I'm not preaching today, but somebody else is, and this person's going to be preaching via DVD. And I remember the DVD started playing, and this giant logo just kind of scrolled across that said RZIM. And then Ravi walked up on the stage, and I still remember the name of the sermon was called "A Fish Out of Water." And the sermon was about Jonah. And you know what, Matt? I had never heard anyone preach on Jonah like that before. And I remember toward the end of that sermon, just tears just streaming down my face, and the Lord just really used that to convict me. And I walked out of there a very different person. And after that, over the next year or two, I just poured myself into learning more about Ravi, and I bought a lot of his books and his DVDs and CDs, and it really set me on the course for Christian apologetics.
That's great. That's great. Pastor Paul, I've got a question for you on his books or sermons. What would you say one or maybe a few of those that have impacted you in a significant way? Or maybe his lectures, like Prashanth just shared.
Yeah, I think the thing that always impressed me about Ravi was, while he was passionately committed to truth and apologetics, he was always gentle. I heard him say one time that he felt like love was the greatest apologetic. And certainly wouldn't mention names, but I've heard others in the field of apologetics who did not come across loving. And that was the thing that always struck me with Ravi is he had a way of being bold and loving all at the same time. And, I even saw online, was reminded, and a skeptic was, asking him, why did he always want to focus on the fact that people were bad and, maybe people were really good. And so basically Ravi just stepped up and said, do you lock your doors at night? And the guy said, yes. And of course, so, but it was gentle, and so I don't know. That's what I appreciated so much about Ravi Zacharias is he was deeply intellectual, but also humble. He didn't come across arrogant.
Yeah. Yeah. How about you, Phil? Any books or sermons? I know that every time I seem to walk up by your office, I hear his voice coming across the speakers. So I'd love to hear from you on this.
Well, thank you, Matt. This guy's near and dear to my heart. When I think about books, I think about Why Suffering. I bought his latest edition with Vince Vitale about 6 years ago, 2014-ish. It was coming out of a time, year and a half before that, where I had suffered greatly with an injury. And I had begun to read William Lane Craig. And by that time, I really began to dive in and read that book. And I realized it's written from a philosophical viewpoint, but yet the meat of it is so deep, it touched my soul. It touched me to my inner man. And I realized that with the problem of pain and suffering, which is going to be with us forever, that there's something we need to do about it. There's something we can do to be involved in other people's lives. And I sense God directing me to begin to minister to people that are hurting, people that are dying, people that have great need. And it was Ravi and Vince both just stirred me to the depth of my core that I wanted to make a difference in other people's lives in their time of need.
Yeah. So the next question, and I'll have all three of you answer individually, is someone who's listening to this podcast or watching it, what would you say to them when they would say, why should I read apologetics books, and why should I care about kind of cultivating a culture of reading when it comes to men like Ravi and other authors out there? I'll start with you, Prashant. Why should we care about reading books written by men on the subject of apologetics?
Well, first of all, we should care about the truth. We should care about the truth because the Bible tells us we should care about the truth. And we should care about giving a reason for our convictions, also for the same reason, because God tells us that we should care about giving a reason for our convictions, but we need to do it with gentleness and respect. This is what 1 Peter 3:15 says. And so I think, and I've mentioned this in my Wednesday night class, I think sometimes there's a sort of misconception in the Christian world that, when we go out into the world and when we share the gospel, when we talk about Jesus Christ, even if we're talking to a full-blown atheist or a skeptic or someone like that, there's this false idea, I think, that when they hear that immediately, their heart's going to melt, the tears are going to start flowing, and they're just going to give up their heart to Jesus. Most of the time, that's usually not how it plays out. At least if you're talking to a skeptic or a full-blown atheist, usually they're going to have questions, and even if they don't push back, even if there's no hostility or anything like that, there's going to be questions that come back. Well, okay, how does that work, that someone who died 2,000 years ago on a cross atoned for my sins today? Like, these are all very important questions that all of us as Christian ambassadors need to be able to give a response to. And I think this is the great testimony of amazing men like Ravi, whom the Lord used powerfully as voices of reason and truth in our culture. And Ravi had this incredible ability to connect the mind and the heart. It wasn't all just cerebral. When you listen to Ravi, he can come across as sophisticated, he can come across as, very intellectual, but if you listen to him long enough, you will feel your heart soar. And Phil can attest to this as well. You'll feel your heart and your mind just beautifully go back and forth, which is exactly how God wants us to operate and function, right? And I think one of the things that made Ravi exceptionally good at what he did was that he always emphasized that there is always a questioner behind the question. And I think sometimes those of us who are in the field of apologetics, we can make the mistake of becoming too clinical in our approach. And when somebody asks us a question, we think of it as an issue. We think of it as, okay, that's just a question, I'm going to talk about the question. But nobody's thinking about the person behind the question. Nobody's thinking about what is it exactly in that person's life that has caused them to ask that particular question. What struggles are going on in their heart and mind? What are they grappling with? What is their worldview like? What is their perception of God? And all these, it's a cauldron of different kind of things going on. And Ravi showed by example that when a Christian gives a response to questions like that, we ought to do it like Jesus Christ. Because Jesus did not just treat a question as a question. He wasn't abstract. He spoke to the whole person. He spoke to the whole mind and soul and heart and reason of the person. And that is why all of us should be good ambassadors of the Christian faith. This is why we are supposed to model our evangelism after Jesus, not after Ravi, but after Jesus, right? And so Ravi was very good at modeling that, and the Lord took him before, heads of state and powerful people all over the world, and he so beautifully was able to be a winsome ambassador of the gospel. And Ravi often quoted a little saying. It's an Indian saying, which I'm very familiar with. The saying sounds a little different in each language. The variations of it are slightly different, but they all basically mean the same thing. And Ravi would often say that his mom would tell him, you cannot cut off a person's nose and then offer him a rose to smell, right? And it sounds more beautiful when you actually listen to it in the Indian language, in one of the Indian languages, but that's true, isn't it? I think your methodology is just as important as the message. So if you're going to talk about the gospel, if you're going to talk about the grace and love of Jesus Christ, you have to embody those characteristics as well. And I think Ravi did that masterfully, and all of us ought to do the same thing. That's why I would say it's important for us to look at these great men who have gone before us and to be able to stand on their shoulders and represent Jesus faithfully the way they did.
Amen. Paul, how about you? Why is it important to you that we communicate this so clearly, that apologetics and understanding of defending the truth is important, not just for guys like Ravi, but for us and for generations to come?
Yeah, we had a tragedy in our community over the weekend. 9-year-old little boy was hit by a car, just an accident. 70-year-old man accidentally hit him and killed him. And, these are the things that you don't see coming, but these are realities in the fallen world that we live in. And the great theologian Mike Tyson, I think, said, everybody has a plan until he gets punched in the mouth. And, you know, we all have those experiences in life where we just get punched in the mouth. And if I understand right, in Ravi's obituary, when he was 17 years old, he was at the point of suicide. And, you know, he even talks in the obituary, it talks about kind of the beginning and the birth of the, you know, Let My People Think and the RZIM ministry. And he had given a talk at a Billy Graham event, like in 1983, I think it was. And anyway, I clipped out a quote here. It says, flying back to the U.S., Zacharias shared his thoughts with Margie. As one colleague has expressed, he saw the objections and questions of others not as something to be rebuffed, but as the cry of the heart that had to be answered. People weren't logical problems waiting to be solved. They were people who needed the person of Christ. Yeah. No one was reaching out to the thinker, to the questioner. And it was on that flight that Zacharias and Margie planted the seed of a ministry intended to meet the thinker where they were, to train cultural evangelists / apologists to reach those opinion makers of society. And so, you know, no matter who you are, there are going to be those dark days. We live in a world full of suffering. We live in a world where little boys get hit on their bicycles in little small towns in southern Iowa. And people are going to have legitimate questions. And so I think the reason we need to read and to study and to be ready is because God will give us those windows of opportunity to offer people truth. And Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so ultimately, it will open doors for us to talk about our Savior, to talk about Jesus, and to bring some kind of meaning to the struggle and to the deep questions in life. So those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah. Phil, how about you? Any closing remarks?
I just want to reiterate, of course, Prashant stole what I wanted to say, and I didn't have a lot to say there, but Ravi understood that there was a questioner behind the question. And to me, that's so important, is because I have not always looked at some people with the questions as the questioner, but that's something that I have to answer to win at. I had to overcome them in where they're at to get them to understand when I needed to be listening to their heart and taking time to process that myself. Ravi never, of all the talks and answers I've heard him give, never did he try to win. He tried to get across to them and understand them so they could get to the core. Why are they thinking what they're thinking? Again, I'm borrowing from what's already been said, but
you know, I just want to kind of piggyback on what Phil said. And, you know, for those of you listening online, I just want to say this. I think sometimes there's also a misconception about apologetics. There's kind of this idea that apologetics is a sort of very special theological stream that only certain people are qualified to do. I don't think that's the case. I think the Bible is pretty clear that we are all supposed to be apologists in our own manner. We are all supposed to give a defense for the gospel. We're all supposed to give a reason for the hope that is in us. And so this is one of the points I try to make over and over again in my advocates class, is that I don't want you to believe Christianity because it makes you feel good. I don't want you to believe Christianity because that's what you were taught at Sunday school as a kid. I want you to believe Christianity because it's true. And here are the rational, intellectual reasons that give Christianity so much truth, right? And Ravi often quotes this story of, this French philosopher, Voltaire, from a long time ago, who said very famously that in 100 years, the Bible will be obsolete, and we will be standing on its grave, and ironically enough, Voltaire passed away and he's gone. It's been a long time. And his home today is the French Bible Society. So, for those of you who think that God doesn't have a sense of humor, the fact of the matter is that the Christian truth always outlives its pallbearers. And this is something that Ravi used to say regularly. There have been people throughout history who have tried to bury Christianity, who have tried to dismiss it, and it always, always rises above everything that comes against its way. And I think this is the important thing to remember about Ravi's ministry, is he wasn't interested in just giving an answer. Like Phil said, he was interested in giving an answer for the sake of the gospel. Okay, because what's the use if you just answer a question and then it doesn't appeal or apply to the person's heart and brings about any sort of transformative change? Obviously, we're not saying that our responses are going to transform the person's heart. Only the Holy Spirit can do that. But but God is still using us as an agent. Every morning he's using Pastor Paul as a medium, as an agent, to speak truth into the hearts and minds of people. And so that is why there's a level of responsibility. There's a level of careful preparation that all of us put ourselves through before we go and speak to somebody. And so this is the important thing to remember about Ravi and his ministry is he didn't just assume that these questions were coming in a vacuum. There was always a person behind that question, and it was more important to speak to that person, even if you didn't really give a comprehensive response to their question.
Yeah. Paul, do you have any closing remarks? Anything else?
Oh my goodness, how much time do we have? There's so much. I don't want to take away. I know Phil has a lot of things he wants to say as well. But I'll say this. Ravi had a gift. He had this ability to seamlessly blend in the Eastern and Western worldviews while imparting truth. He had this ability to connect the heart and the mind intellectually and emotionally, using little anecdotes and stories and songs and even poetry. He was comfortable in casual settings and academic settings and political settings, and God used that to take him to great places. In fact, I don't know how many of you know this, but Ravi was actually the first evangelical Christian since the late great D.L. Moody to go speak at the Mormon Tabernacle in Utah. The last time somebody had done that was Dwight L. Moody, who was the founder of the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. And Brigham Young himself had invited Moody back in 1871 to come and speak there. And no other evangelical Christian had spoken there since then until Ravi was invited. And so, these are just incredible things that the Lord used with his ministry. And so even as we kind of close, this is, in a sense, I remember even kind of preparing for this podcast was a little emotional, because I was like, man, I have to really process this hero of my faith and everything that he has been. And the path that I am on today is precisely because of Ravi. And it goes all the way back, to what Pastor Paul said when he was 17 years old, lying on a bed of suicide, and somebody walked in and handed him a little Gideon's New Testament. And, he read the Gospel of John to Ravi while he was on this bed of suicide. And Ravi says this later. He says, 7 words changed my life. And that's the words of Jesus in John 14:19, where Jesus says, because I live, you too shall live. Mm-hmm. And I think that is ultimately what changed Ravi's heart, was that he pleaded out to God and he said, God, if you take me out of this hospital, I will leave no stone unturned for the sake of the gospel. And he did that faithfully for over 50 years. And the Lord now said, well done, my good and faithful servant, come home. And so for those of us left behind, it's just, it should motivate us. It should encourage us to continue to live with that sense of determination that the gospel is not only worth dying for, it's worth living for as well. My wife often says this, and And this is why we should not be lukewarm with our lives, but live it with purpose and meaning, and do it for the sake of the gospel. And that is worth everything. And thank you to the great men like Ravi for leaving us that legacy that we can model.
Prashant, the other thing that I think just warms my heart when I think about Ravi's legacy is I don't expect RZIM to disappear because Ravi has gone to heaven. I mean, he really has left, I think, 100 speakers who are still going to be continuing the work. And it says in the obituary that what was once run from his home is now a ministry in 17 countries on 5 continents. And so I pray that we will take people with us, and that we will be willing to share the stage, share the mic, share the opportunities, and raise up those who will come behind us and continue, the kingdom work after the Lord calls us home. And so I think that's another legacy that he left us.
Amen. Amen. Well, gentlemen, it's been fun to remember our hero of the faith. And I think we would all say to those listening, it is important to have men who you can look to that inspire you. It is important to have men that are gentle in their response and holding fast to the truth without wavering, and willing to give an answer for the hope that they have with gentleness and respect. And Ravi has done this magnificently. And I pray that us on this podcast would do the same with our lives. Give our every breath to defend the truth with gentleness and respect, and continue to raise up other people that do the same.
Amen.
It has been a joy to talk about Ravi's life with you guys this evening. We hoped also that you've enjoyed the discussion. If you liked what you heard, please make sure to subscribe to our podcast right on our Cornerstone app. But until then, have a blessed week, and we'll meet again on our next episode of Truth Bytes.